In a small Wyoming town where dreams often fade like sunset colors, Sarah held another rejection letter. At 45, she'd heard it too many times. She was too old to be a mail-order bride. The lonely farmhouse she'd inherited seemed to echo with emptiness, until the morning a stranger's horse stopped at her fence. Thomas wasn't like the others who'd dismissed her. His eyes held wisdom earned through hardship, and his gentle smile saw beyond the numbers that others couldn't forget. But even as hope bloomed like spring flowers, Thomas carried burdens of his own that threatened to keep his heart forever locked away. What made this hardened cowboy finally ready to love again? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dawn crept across the Wyoming plains, painting the farmhouse in shades of amber and rose. Sarah's footsteps echoed through the old wooden hallway as she made her morning rounds, each creak of the floorboards as familiar as her own heartbeat. She paused at the window, watching the sun climb over distant mountains while her coffee cooled in her grandmother's chipped blue mug. The quilt lay folded at the foot of her bed, just as it had every morning since her grandmother's passing 3 years ago. Each patch told a story: the faded blue calico from her mother's wedding dress, the checkered square from her father's favorite shirt, the yellow sunflower print from the curtains that once hung in this very room. Sarah ran her fingers over the careful stitching, remembering how her grandmother's weathered hands had guided hers as a child, teaching her that patience and love could make something beautiful from fragments of the past. "A quilt's like life, sweetheart," her grandmother used to say. "Sometimes the prettiest patterns come from pieces that don't seem to match at first." The morning chores wouldn't wait, no matter how much comfort she found in memories. Sarah pulled on her work boots and headed to the barn, where 2 elderly horses and a small flock of chickens depended on her. The mare nickered softly as Sarah approached with feed, her breath visible in the cool morning air. "At least you don't care how old I am," she murmured, patting the horse's warm neck. The truth of yesterday's rejection letter still stung, but out here, with the simple honesty of animals and honest work, she could almost forget the cruel words typed on crisp paper. The farm barely broke even these days. Tourism had changed the nearby town, turning old ranches into vacation homes and authentic diners into trendy cafes. Sarah's small operation: eggs from her chickens, honey from her beehives, and vegetables from her garden, wasn't enough to keep up with the rising property taxes. The mail-order bride service had seemed like a practical solution, a way to find partnership in both life and livelihood. She hadn't expected it to hurt quite so much. Back in the kitchen, Sarah washed the morning's eggs and arranged them carefully in their cartons. 6 dozen for Mrs. Henderson's bed and breakfast, 2 dozen for the farmer's market, if the weather held for Saturday. Her grandmother's ledger sat open on the counter, its neat columns a testament to years of careful management. Sarah's own entries were just as precise, but the bottom line told an increasingly worrying story. The mail-order bride service had seemed practical at first. So many remote ranches and farms needed capable hands, experienced help. Sarah had skills: cooking, gardening, animal husbandry, basic maintenance. She knew how to keep a homestead running. But every response came back the same: too old, too settled, too set in her ways. Seeking younger woman, 20-35, for marriage and family, the latest rejection had read. "While we appreciate your interest," Sarah set down the egg she was washing before her grip could tighten enough to crack it. Waste was a luxury she couldn't afford, not with winter coming and the property taxes due. Her grandmother had taught her better than that. The quilt caught her eye again as she passed the bedroom door. Those stitches had held through 40 years of winters, through births and deaths, through storms and droughts, each piece carefully chosen, each stitch made with purpose. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "Nothing's too worn out to be useful, Sarah. Nothing's too old to be beautiful. It's all in how you see it." Sarah straightened her shoulders and reached for her market ledger. She had deliveries to make, seeds to plant, and a farm to run. Age was just a number after all. The right person would see that, or they wouldn't. Either way, the sun was rising and there was work to be done. She tucked the rejection letter into the bottom drawer with the others and headed out to face another day on her own terms, the rising sun warming her back as she walked toward the garden. The morning glories were beginning to bloom along the fence. Their purple faces turned toward the light, caring nothing for the number of springs they'd seen. The bell above the post office door chimed as Sarah stepped inside, clutching a manila envelope to her chest. Mary, the postmistress of 30 years, looked up from her stamp organizing with knowing eyes. "Back again?" Mary asked softly, her lined face kind. "I was hoping that last one might have been different." Sarah placed the envelope on the counter, her fingers lingering on its edge. One more try. Just one more. She'd spent the morning carefully typing her new advertisement on her grandmother's old typewriter, each key stroke deliberate and honest. "Let me see," Mary said, reaching for her reading glasses. She'd been Sarah's confidant through each attempt, each rejection. The older woman unfolded the paper and began to read aloud. "Experienced homesteader seeks partnership, 45 years young, with skills in farm management, animal husbandry, and home economics. Own property with room for growth. Looking for someone who values capability over convention, wisdom over youth. Age immaterial, if heart and work ethic are strong." Mary looked up, eyes bright behind her glasses. "You told the truth about your age. No point hiding it anymore. Better they know from the start." Sarah straightened her shoulders. "I'm done apologizing for having lived." The postmistress nodded slowly, respect evident in her expression. "You know, my Harold was 12 years older than me. Best man I ever knew. Met him when I was 38. All the town gossip said I was past my prime." She chuckled. 20 happy years we had together." Sarah watched as Mary carefully addressed the envelope to the Western Hearts Correspondence Service. The older woman's hands moved with practiced efficiency, but she took extra care with this one, making each letter perfect. "Sometimes I think about giving up," Sarah admitted. "Just accepting that the farm and I are both too set in our ways." "Nonsense," Mary said firmly, pressing the stamp into place. "My mother used to say every pot has its lid, just takes some longer to find the right fit." She rang up the postage. "No charge for this one. Consider it my investment in a good love." "Story," Sarah protested, but Mary waved her off. "I've got a feeling about this one. Something's different." Walking back to her truck, Sarah felt lighter somehow. The morning sun caught the dew on the spring grass, making the world sparkle. Maybe Mary was right. Maybe this time would be different. At home, she tucked a copy of the advertisement into her grandmother's Bible, between the pages where her parents' wedding announcement was pressed. The yellowed newspaper clipping showed them young and smiling, unaware of the tragedy that would take them both just 15 years later, leaving Sarah to be raised by her grandmother. "I'm trying, Grandma," she whispered to the empty room. "I'm trying to be as brave as you were." Her grandmother had run this farm alone for 20 years after her grandfather passed, refusing all offers to sell, keeping the land in the family. Through sheer determination, she'd taught Sarah that independence wasn't the same as loneliness, that being capable didn't mean you couldn't also want companionship. The afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains, casting delicate shadows. On the floor, Sarah sat at her grandmother's writing desk, opening the ledger to review the farm's finances yet again. The numbers hadn't changed, but somehow her perspective had. This wasn't just about finding help to save the farm anymore. It was about being honest with herself and the world, about who she was and what she wanted. She picked up her pen and began to write in the margins of the ledger, making a list of all she had to offer: experience, stability, a home with history, a heart that knew both loss and joy. Looking at it there in black and white, she realized these weren't limitations. They were credentials earned through living. The sun was setting when she finally closed the ledger, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. For now, she had eggs to collect, horses to feed, and a life that was hers, however incomplete it might feel at times. A week after sending her advertisement, Sarah was checking the fence line when she saw him, a lone rider on a chestnut quarter horse, moving slow along the road that bordered her property. Something about the horse's gait caught her eye, a slight favoring of its left front leg. The man noticed too. He drew the horse to a stop near her broken fence post, one she'd been meaning to fix since the last storm. His eyes met hers across the distance, and he touched the brim of his hat in greeting. "Your horse is limping," Sarah called out, setting down her toolbox. 20 years of caring for animals had taught her to spot trouble early. "Started about a mile back," he answered, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "Don't suppose you'd know of a place I could rest him?" Sarah studied the man as he dismounted. Tall, with silver threading his dark hair, he moved with the easy grace of someone comfortable in his own skin. His clothes were worn but well kept, and his eyes, when they met hers, were the clear blue of a winter sky. "I've got a barn," she offered, "and some liniment if you need it." He nodded gratefully, leading his horse toward her gate. Up close, she could see the years etched around his eyes and mouth. Laugh lines and worry lines in equal measure. "Thomas," he said simply, extending his hand. His grip was warm and solid. "Sarah." She found herself noticing the strength in his weathered hands, the gentle way he handled his horse's reins. "This post has been giving me trouble," she added, gesturing to the broken fence. "Seems the whole property's falling apart faster than I can fix it." Something flickered in his expression. Recognition, perhaps, of a shared struggle. "Mind if I take a look while my horse rests?" In the barn, Sarah watched as Thomas examined his horse's leg with practiced care. His movements were sure but gentle, earning a nickering of trust from the animal. "Just a stone bruise," he concluded. "Nothing serious. But he'll need a day or two." He straightened up, looking at her directly. "I can help with that fence post. Maybe earn my horse's keep." Sarah should have hesitated, should have been wary of a stranger offering help. But something in his manner, the respect in his eyes when he looked at her, the way he'd noticed the fence needed fixing without her having to mention it, made her nod. "There's water for your horse," she said, "and coffee in the house, if you'd like some before starting." The spring morning stretched out before them, full of possibility. Thomas tied his horse in a shady spot and retrieved tools from his saddlebags, good ones, well used but cared for. Sarah recognized the hands of someone who knew the value of maintaining what they had. They worked together without much talk, falling into an easy rhythm. When Thomas did speak, his words were thoughtful, measured. He asked about the farm, listened to her answers with genuine interest. Not once did his eyes hold the dismissive look she'd grown used to from younger men. "Learned this from my father," he said as he showed her a better way to brace the post. "He always said a fence is only as good as its foundation." Sarah watched his hands as he worked, noting the wedding ring was long gone, but had left its mark. Another story there, she thought, but didn't ask. Everyone had their reasons for being on the road, for stopping at broken fences. The sun was high when they finished, the new post standing straight and true. Thomas stepped back to survey their work, satisfaction evident in his stance. "That'll hold," he said quietly. Through winter storms and spring floods, Sarah felt the truth of his words settle in her chest, solid as the post they'd just set. "You'll stay until your horse is sound?" she found herself asking. He looked at her then, really looked, as if seeing past the work-worn clothes and sun-weathered skin to something else, something worth seeing. "If you're offering," he said softly. The afternoon breeze carried the scent of spring grass and distant rain. Sarah thought of the advertisement she'd sent out, wondering if sometimes answers came in unexpected ways, at unexpected fences. Dawn painted the kitchen in shades of gold when Sarah heard his boots on the porch. She'd been up since first light, the old coffee pot bubbling on the stove, her grandmother's favorite, blue enamel chipped, but still reliable. 2 cups sat, ready on the counter, a peace offering and an invitation. Thomas stepped inside, bringing with him the crisp morning air and the scent of hay from the barn. "Horse is doing better," he said by way of greeting. His eyes caught on the coffee cups, a smile touching the corners of his mouth. "You're up early." "Farm time?" Sarah replied, pouring the coffee. "Sugar?" "Black is fine." He accepted the cup. Careful not to brush her fingers. Always careful, she'd noticed, to maintain that polite distance. They sat at the kitchen table, morning light streaming through windows that needed washing. The coffee pot between them steamed gently, its familiar percolating a counterpoint to the comfortable silence. "You've been here long?" Thomas asked. Finally, his voice thoughtful. Sarah traced the rim of her cup. "Born here, left for college, came back when my parents died. Grandmother needed help." She paused, memories surfacing. "Stayed after she passed. 3 years now, on my own." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Roots go deep. Too deep, maybe. Everyone says I should sell, move somewhere easier." She hadn't meant to share that, but something about the quiet morning, the steam rising from their cups, made honesty feel natural. Easier isn't always better. Thomas's hands cradled his cup, strong hands marked by years of work. "Sometimes what looks like holding on is really standing your ground." Sarah studied him over the rim of her coffee cup. "Sounds like you know something about that." A shadow crossed his face, quick as a cloud passing the sun. "Had a ranch in Montana. Lost it after Claire, my wife, passed. Cancer." He said it simply, without self-pity. "Daughter wanted to sell. She was right, probably, but it was home," Sarah finished softly. Their eyes met across the table, recognition flowing between them like the morning light. Here was someone who understood the weight of memories, the cost of choices made and unmade. "Your daughter," Sarah ventured. "You see her?" "Christmas, mostly. She's got her own life in Denver. 2 kids. Pride warmed his voice. But there was sadness, too. Time gets away from you. One day they're learning to ride, next day they're grown, with children of their own. The coffee pot had gone quiet, morning settling around them like a comfortable blanket. Outside, a meadowlark began its song, clear notes carrying through the open window. "I always wanted children," Sarah found herself saying, "but life had other plans. Now everyone says I'm too—" She stopped, the word sticking in her throat. "Too what?" Thomas's voice was gentle but firm. "Old," she finished, meeting his eyes squarely. "Too old for fresh starts." He set his cup down carefully, deliberation in every movement. "Age is just numbers. Life's about what you do with the time you have, not how much of it's behind you." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with truth and possibility. Sarah thought of her advertisement, still making its way through the mail system, searching for something she might have already found. "Your horse," she said after a moment. "How long before he's ready to travel?" Thomas looked out the window where morning glory vines climbed the porch rails, their purple blooms just opening. "To the sun." "No hurry," he said quietly, "if you don't mind the company." Sarah stood to pour them both more coffee, her grandmother's pot still keeping it warm. As she sat back down, she noticed how the morning light caught the silver in Thomas's hair, how it softened the lines around his eyes, not erasing them, she wouldn't want that, but highlighting them like traces of stories yet to be shared. Company would be nice, she said, and knew it for truth. The next afternoon's rain drove them inside early from fence mending. Sarah was hanging their wet coats when she noticed it, a leather-bound journal that had fallen from Thomas's pocket, its pages splayed open on the wooden floor. She picked it up instinctively, meaning only to close it, when a pressed flower slipped from between its pages. A dried purple iris, still holding its color after what must have been years. Beneath it, in careful handwriting, Claire's favorite. "Last bloom before winter came. Found my ghosts, I see." Sarah startled at Thomas's voice behind her. He stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable but not angry. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, holding out the journal. "It fell from your coat. I didn't mean to pry." Thomas took the journal, his fingers gentle with the worn leather. "No harm done. Claire always said a person's story wants telling, one way or another." He looked down at the pressed flower. "Guess she was right about that too." Rain drummed steadily on the tin roof as Thomas sat heavily in her grandmother's old rocker. The journal lay open in his lap, the purple iris a splash of colour against the weathered pages. "She loved gardens," he said softly. "Spent our first year together turning the ranch yard into something out of a magazine. Irises everywhere, said they were survivors, like her." His voice caught slightly. 15 years we had. Not nearly enough." Sarah sat quietly in the window seat, understanding. The gift of this shared grief. "How long ago?" 8 years this October." Thomas traced the flower's dried petals. "Cancer took her quick, at least. But the ranch," he shook his head. "Everything reminded me of her. Every iris bed, every morning sunrise. Jessica, my daughter, she tried to help, but the memories were too loud," Sarah finished gently. He nodded, turning a page in the journal. "Started writing to her after. Letters, memories, things I wish I'd said. Filled 3 of these books before I realized I was writing myself into circles of grief." Lightning flickered outside, followed by distant thunder. Sarah thought of her own letters, the ones she'd written to her parents after the accident, to her grandmother after she passed. Understanding bloomed between them like the iris Thomas still treasured. "So, you took to the road," she said. "Not a question. Sold the ranch, been moving ever since. Taking odd jobs, helping where I can." His eyes met hers. "Running maybe, or looking, not sure anymore." Sarah stood, moving to the kitchen with purpose. Some moments needed more than words. She returned with 2 cups of tea and her grandmother's. "Tin of butter cookies. My grandmother used to say grief is like weather," she offered, holding out a cookie. "You can't stop it, can't rush it. Just have to learn to live in it until it changes." Thomas took a cookie, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Smart woman." "She also said," Sarah continued, settling back in the window seat, "that the heart is like her garden. Doesn't matter if winter kills everything back to ground. Come spring, something always grows." The rain fell softer now, more gentle than grieving. Thomas closed the journal, tucking the iris carefully back between its pages. "Your grandmother," he said quietly. "Think she'd mind me using her rocker a while longer?" Sarah watched how naturally he fit there, his strong hands at rest on the chair's worn arms. "I think she'd like knowing it was being used by someone who understands about growing things back from ground." They sat in comfortable silence as afternoon eased toward evening, the rain washing the world clean outside. Sarah thought about the journal, about letters written to lost loves, about purple irises stubbornly blooming through grief. She thought about her own advertisement, still traveling through the mail system, seeking connection. Sometimes, she realized, answers came in unexpected forms, not in return letters from strangers, but in journals fallen from pockets, in pressed flowers, in stories shared on rainy afternoons. "Tell me about her," she said softly, "about Claire." Thomas's smile, when it came, held both sadness and gratitude. Outside, the rain began to ease, and the first hints of sunset gold pierced the clouds. The storm came without warning, the way spring storms often do in Wyoming. One moment the afternoon was clear, the next dark clouds rolled over the mountains like a stampede. Sarah was in the garden when the first fat drops fell, Thomas repairing a chicken coop nearby. "Weather's turning mean," he called out, already moving toward her with purpose. Those clouds looked like trouble. A sharp crack of thunder punctuated his words, sending the chickens scattering in panic. The wind picked up suddenly, whipping Sarah's hair free of its practical braid. "The barn!" she shouted over the rising gale. "Roof's been weak since winter. Animals need moving." They ran together through the strengthening rain, Sarah's heart pounding with more than exertion. The old barn had weathered countless storms, but something in the air told her this one was different. Inside, the horses stamped nervously, sensing the changing pressure. Thomas immediately went to them, his calm presence settling their fear. "Where do we take them?" "Storage shed's got a solid roof," Sarah said, already untying the first horse. "Built it new last year, but it's across the yard." Rain hammered the barn's tin roof as they worked quickly, efficiently, moving animals to safety. They had just led the last horse out when a terrible groaning sound came from above. Sarah looked up to see the old wooden beams flexing under the strain. "Sarah!" Thomas's voice cut through the storm's fury. His hand caught her arm, pulling her toward the door. They stumbled out into the rain just as a section of the roof gave way with a thunderous crash. For a moment, they stood in the driving rain, watching helplessly as decades of family history crumbled. Thomas's hand was still on her arm, warm despite the cold rain. Sarah found herself leaning into that strength, accepting it. "The animals," she said finally, her voice shaking. "We need to—" "They're safe," he assured her, "but we need to get to cover. This storm's not done with us yet." They ran for the house, rain and wind battering them from all sides. Sarah's boots slipped in the mud, but Thomas's steady hand kept her upright. By the time they reached the porch, they were both soaked to the skin. Inside, Sarah moved on autopilot, finding towels, her grandmother's lessons in crisis management, taking over. "There are dry clothes of my father's in the upstairs bedroom," she told Thomas. "Should fit well enough." He nodded, taking the towel she offered. "I'll check on the animals once I've changed. Make sure the shed's holding. I'll come with you, Sarah." His voice was gentle but firm. "You're shivering. Get warm first. I can handle this part." She wanted to argue, but the wisdom of his words was undeniable. Still, she waited by the window, watching as he made his way through the storm to the storage shed. Even through the rain-blurred glass, she could see the confidence in his movements, the sure way he handled the frightened animals. When he returned, wearing her father's old flannel shirt and work pants, she had coffee waiting. They sat at the kitchen table, listening to the storm rage outside, both acutely aware of how this crisis had shifted something between them. "Barn's a total loss," Thomas said finally, cradling his coffee cup. "Roof's completely gone on the north side." Sarah nodded, throat tight. "Been standing since my grandfather built it. Thought it would outlast me." "Hey." Thomas's hand covered hers where it rested on the table. "We'll rebuild it. Stronger than before." "We." The word hung in the air between them, full of possibility. "Insurance won't cover much," she said, testing him. "Don't need much. Got good timber in those hills, and I know barn raising. Did plenty of them in Montana." His thumb traced a gentle pattern on her knuckles. "Just need willing hands and neighbors who can swing a hammer." The storm was beginning to ease, its fury spending itself against the mountains. In its wake, the air felt cleared, renewed, like the world after her first loss, different but not ended. "Why are you still here, Thomas?" she asked softly. "Your horse has been sound for days." He was quiet for a long moment, his hand still warm on hers. "Maybe I'm tired of running. Maybe I found something worth staying for." Lightning flickered, distantly, illuminating his face. In that brief flash, Sarah saw everything, the grief, the healing, the hope. Most of all, she saw the future, undefined but full of promise. "The barn will need a good foundation," she said. His fingers tightened, gently around hers. "Yes," he replied, "it will." The general store's bell chimed as Sarah pushed open the door, her shopping list clutched in one hand. She needed supplies for the barn rebuilding, nails, fresh work gloves, enough food to feed the volunteers Thomas had somehow rounded up. She'd barely made it 3 steps inside when she noticed the change in atmosphere. Mrs. Peterson and Betty Williams stopped their conversation abruptly, offering tight smiles. Behind the counter, old Mr. Johnson suddenly became very interested in his receipt book. Only Mary, arranging a display of canned goods, met her eyes with genuine warmth. "Heard you got yourself a handyman," Mrs. Peterson said, her voice honey-sweet, but probing. How fortunate at your age. Sarah straightened her spine, remembering Thomas's quiet strength. Got myself a partner, she corrected firmly, one who knows the value of hard work. She placed her items on the counter, work gloves, coffee, sandwich fixings. Mr. Johnson rang them up slowly, clearing his throat. Known him long, have you? He asked, not quite meeting her eyes. This partner of yours? Long enough to know his worth, Sarah replied. The receipt he handed her was already becoming a town artifact, proof of Thomas's presence in her life, fodder for gossip and speculation. Mary appeared at her elbow, adding a bag of fresh cookies to her purchases. On the house, she said, loudly, for the barn raising. I'll be by later with a casserole. Know how hungry men get during building. The support in Mary's voice was clear, a counter to the whispers that had followed Sarah since Thomas's arrival. As she left the store, she heard Mrs. Peterson's stage whisper, "Well, I never, at her time of life." Outside, the spring sun was bright and unconcerned with small-town opinions. Sarah loaded her purchases into her truck, remembering Thomas's words from that morning. Let them talk. We know what's real. The barn raising was set for Saturday. Already, word had spread beyond the gossip about their relationship. Farmers and ranchers from miles around had promised to come, not for the scandal, but for the work. They understood. About neighbors and need, about communities standing stronger than whispers. Driving home, Sarah passed the diner where she and Thomas had shared breakfast the day before. Through the window, she saw Linda, the waitress, gesturing animatedly to her customers, no doubt telling them how Thomas had pulled out Sarah's chair, how his eyes had never left her face as she spoke, how he'd touched her hand across the table without shame or hesitation. Let them talk indeed. Thomas was mending fence posts when she pulled up to the house. He straightened as she approached, and something in the simple action, the natural way he belonged in her landscape, made the morning's whispers fade to nothing. Got everything? He asked, wiping his hands on his jeans. And then some. Mary's bringing a casserole for Saturday. She paused, then added, Town's talking. He stepped closer, not touching, but near enough that she could feel his warmth. Towns. Always talk. Nature of small places. They think, she hesitated, they think it's inappropriate. Us, at our age. Thomas's laugh was soft but genuine. Inappropriate. To find someone who understands you. To not waste time pretending to be something you're not. His eyes held hers. Maybe that's the gift of our age. Knowing what matters. The wind carried the scent of fresh-cut wood from the barn site, of spring grass and possibilities. Sarah thought of the mail-order bride advertisement, probably arrived at its destination by now. How young and desperate that version of herself seemed, seeking validation from strangers. Mary's on our side, she said, smiling. Thinks we're quite the romance. Smart woman, Mary. Thomas touched her cheek gently. And brave enough to think. For herself. They stood together in the afternoon light, two people who had found each other not too early, not too late, but exactly when they were ready to recognize what mattered. The town could whisper all it wanted. Some things spoke louder than words. The attic had that particular dusty warmth that comes from afternoon sun on old wood. Sarah was searching for more of her father's tools when she found it. Her grandmother's record player still nestled in its wooden cabinet. A stack of vinyl. Albums lay nearby, their covers faded but intact. Found something? Thomas called from below. Maybe, she answered, running her fingers over the cabinet's smooth surface. Help me with this? Together, they carried it down to the living room, Thomas handling most of the weight but letting her help, understanding her need to be part of everything that happened in her home. The player sat naturally in the corner as if it had been waiting to return there. Does it work? Thomas asked, already examining the mechanism with careful hands. Sarah pulled out an album at random, Patsy Cline, her grandmother's favorite. Only one way to find out. The needle scratched softly, then caught the groove. Music filled the room, a little scratchy but clear enough to make out the lyrics. Crazy floated through the evening air, carrying memories of Sunday afternoons when her grandmother would dance with an invisible partner, humming along. "Your grandmother liked the classics," Thomas said, appreciation in his voice. "She always said you hadn't really heard music until you'd heard it on vinyl." Sarah smiled at the memory, said digital was too perfect, too cleaned up. "Life's got scratches," she'd tell me. "So should its music." Thomas held out his hand, something soft and challenging in his eyes. "Dance with me?" Sarah hesitated. It's been years." "So? We're not performing for anyone." His hand remained extended, patient. "Just feel the music." She took his hand, letting him draw her close. His other hand settled naturally at her waist, warm and steady. They moved together, finding a rhythm that had nothing to do with perfection, and everything to do with trust. "My Claire," Thomas said softly, "she loved to dance. Didn't matter where, kitchen, barn, middle of a field. Music was playing in her head, even when there wasn't any around." Sarah rested her head against his shoulder, breathing in the scent of sawdust and sunshine that clung to his shirt. "Tell me about dancing with her." She'd laugh at my timing. His voice rumbled in his chest where her ear pressed close. Said, "I was too busy counting steps to feel the music. Took her months to teach me to let go." They turned slowly, the record scratches adding texture to the melody. Sarah felt the strength in his arms, the sure way he guided their movements. "Seems like she taught you well," she murmured. "She taught me a lot of things." His hand tightened slightly at her waist. "How to love without keeping score. How to let go without losing yourself. How to dance like nobody's watching." The song ended, another beginning. Neither of them moved to part. "Your grandmother," Thomas said after a while. "Did she ever remarry?" Sarah shook her head against his shoulder. "Said she'd had her great love. Anything else would have been settling. And now, what would she say about this?" Sarah lifted her head to look at him, seeing the question in his eyes. "She'd say..." She smiled, remembering her grandmother's wisdom. "She'd say love's like her record player. Might be old, might have some scratches, but the music's sweeter for having lived a little." Thomas's hand moved from her waist to cup her cheek, his thumb tracing the laugh lines at the corner of her eye. "Smart woman, your grandmother." The music played on, but they had stopped dancing, standing close in the golden evening light. Sarah saw the moment his gaze dropped to her lips, saw the question there. "Thomas," she whispered, "too soon." "He?" asked, his voice rough with emotion. She answered by rising on her toes, pressing her lips to his. The kiss was gentle, unhurried, like the way they danced. Two people who had learned that the best things in life couldn't be rushed. When they parted, the record had ended, its soft clicking the only sound besides their breathing. Thomas reached out and lifted the needle, the gesture deliberate and careful. "Some things," he said quietly, "are worth waiting for." Sarah touched the record player, feeling its gentle warmth from the evening sun. Like them, it had been tucked away, forgotten but not finished, waiting for the right moment to play again. The photograph caught the morning light as Sarah dusted the mantel. A younger Thomas, with his arm around a smiling teenage girl, both squinting into the sun. Behind them stood the Montana ranch house he'd eventually sell, its weathered boards, telling stories she was just beginning to understand. A car door slammed outside. Through the window, Sarah saw a sleek SUV pulling up to the house, a woman in her early 30s stepping out. Even at a distance, she recognized Jessica from the photo. Thomas's daughter had her father's way of moving, purposeful and direct. Thomas appeared from the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth. Sarah watched their reunion, the awkward half-hug, the careful distance between them. When they turned toward the house, she busied herself in the kitchen, giving them space. "Dad," Jessica's voice carried through the screen door. "You can't just disappear like that. No calls for weeks, then Mary Henderson tells me you're living with someone?" "Jess." Thomas's tone held patience and something else. Determination. "Come inside. There's someone I want you to meet." Sarah stepped into the living room. wiping suddenly damp palms on her jeans. Jessica's eyes went straight to her, assessing, protective. "So you're the reason my father's ignoring his responsibilities back home," Jessica said, her voice carefully neutral. "Jessica." Thomas's warning was gentle, but firm. "It's all right," Sarah said, meeting the younger woman's gaze. "I understand about protecting family. Would you like some coffee? Fresh-baked cinnamon rolls, too, if you're hungry." Something flickered in Jessica's expression. Surprise, perhaps, at not finding an adversary. "Coffee would be nice." In the kitchen, Sarah moved with practiced ease, setting out her grandmother's best cups. Behind her, she could hear father and daughter speaking in low tones. "The ranch buyer called again," Jessica was saying. "Offer won't stay open forever. Let it close then." "Dad, be reasonable. You can't keep running. Denver's not that far. The kids miss you. We could find you a nice place." Sarah set the coffee tray down perhaps a bit too firmly, the cups rattling. Both turned to look at her. "I'm not running anymore, Jess." Thomas's voice was quiet but certain. He reached for Sarah's hand and she gave it, feeling the strength in his grip. "I'm building something here." Jessica's eyes fixed on their joined hands. "Like you built with Mom." The silence that followed felt heavy enough to touch. Sarah saw the pain flash across Thomas's face, watched him push through it. "No," he said finally. "Different, but just as real." Sarah squeezed his hand once and let go. "I'll give you two some time," she said. But Jessica's voice stopped her. "Wait." The younger woman's tone had softened slightly. "Stay, please. I'd like to understand." They sat together at the kitchen table, morning sun warming the coffee cups. Sarah served the cinnamon rolls, her grandmother's recipe, the one that had won hearts at church suppers for 40 years. "These are good," Jessica admitted, then paused. "Mom used to bake. Tell me about her," Sarah said gently. "I'd like to know." Something in Jessica's face shifted, like ice beginning to thaw. She loved purple irises, had them everywhere. "I know," Sarah said softly. "Your father showed me the one he keeps in his journal." Jessica's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. "He showed you his journal?" "Your father's teaching me about trust," Sarah said, "about how love doesn't diminish when it's shared." Tears welled in Jessica's eyes. "He wouldn't even let me read it. After she died, he just closed up, sold everything, left." "I was wrong," Thomas said quietly, "about a lot of things. Running, hiding the hurt, thinking I could pack up grief like furniture and store it away." "And now?" Jessica asked, something like hope in her voice. Thomas looked at Sarah, then back to his daughter. "Now I'm learning that hearts are like old houses. Sometimes they need rebuilding, but the foundation's still good." Sarah watched as Jessica processed this, saw the moment she chose to try understanding. "The kids really do miss you," Jessica said finally. "Tommy's learning to ride. He could use his grandpa's advice." "Plenty of room here for visitors," Sarah offered, "if you'd like to bring them sometime." Later, watching Jessica's SUV disappear down the drive, Sarah felt Thomas's arms slip around her waist. "Thank you," he murmured against her hair. "For what?" "For making space, for understanding about piecing families back together." Sarah turned in his embrace, touching the lines of worry that had eased around his eyes. "Some things are worth the work of rebuilding." Sarah's garden tools had stories etched into their handles, smooth spots worn by years of use, her grandmother's initials carved into the wood, rust that spoke of seasons past. Thomas held her favorite trowel now, studying the way the morning light caught its well-worn edge. "Your grandmother taught you gardening too?" he asked, working the soil around a tomato plant. Sarah nodded, pulling weeds from between the rows of vegetables. Summer heat pressed down on them both, but the work felt good, purposeful. She said a garden's like a relationship. Needs daily tending, but you can't force it to grow faster than it wants to. Wise woman. Thomas's hands moved with careful strength among the plants. "My Claire tried teaching me once, said I was too impatient, wanted everything to bloom at once. And now," he looked up, meeting her eyes across the neat rows. Now I understand about waiting, about letting things grow in their own time. They worked in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from knowing you don't need to fill every moment with words. The garden stretched before them, tomatoes heavy on their vines, beans climbing their poles, squash blossoms opening to the morning. "Son, been thinking," Thomas said finally, sitting back on his heels. "About roots." Sarah paused in her weeding, watching him choose his words. "Jessica's right about one thing. Can't keep living like I'm just passing through." He ran a hand through his silver-streaked hair. "Might be time to put down some roots again." Sarah's heart quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "Roots need good soil." "They do." He moved closer, taking her soil-stained hand in his equally dirty one. "Think this soil's good enough for two?" A butterfly landed on a nearby tomato cage, its wings opening and closing slowly in the summer heat. Sarah thought about the garden, about how it had sustained her through lonely years, about how different it felt now, with two sets of hands tending it. "Soil's been waiting for the right seeds," she said softly. Thomas's thumb traced patterns on her palm. "Been looking at that piece of land that joins your south pasture. Anderson's wanting to sell." Sarah's breath caught. "Thomas, not asking for answers now," he said quickly. "Just supplanting ideas, seeing what might grow." She looked at their joined hands, dirt under both their fingernails, age spots and scars telling stories of lives well lived. "Ideas need tending too." "That they do." He lifted her hand, pressed a kiss to her knuckles, dirt and all. "Good thing we're both experienced gardeners." The sun climbed higher as they returned to their work, but something had shifted in the air between them. Each plant they tended felt like a promise, each seed they planted like a possibility. Sarah found herself watching him when he wasn't looking, the sure way he handled the delicate seedlings, how he knew instinctively which plants needed staking, which needed more space. A man who understood about nurturing things, about helping them grow strong. "Found this in the tool shed," he said later, holding up an old hand-drawn garden plan in her grandmother's writing. "Thought it might help with the fall planting." Sarah took the weathered paper, recognizing the careful notations about crop rotation, companion planting, soil amendments. Her grandmother's wisdom, preserved in fading ink. "She'd like you," she said suddenly. "My grandmother. She'd say you know how to listen to the land." Thomas stepped closer, his hand finding the small of her back. "And what do you say?" She turned into his embrace, not caring about the dirt on their clothes, the sweat on their skin. "I say some harvests are worth the wait," the garden hummed. With life around them, bees visiting the squash blossoms, birds calling from the apple trees, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of ripening tomatoes. Everything growing, everything changing, everything exactly as it should be. "Dinner tonight?" Thomas asked. "Fresh vegetables, maybe some of that sourdough bread you've been nursing along?" Sarah smiled, thinking of how naturally he'd fit into her kitchen, how right it felt to cook for two again, like a real family. His arms tightened around her. Getting there one day at a time, one meal at a time. Above them, the summer sky stretched endless and blue, full of promise like freshly turned soil. Sarah found the bundle of rejection letters while cleaning out her desk drawer, a thick stack held together with a faded rubber band. She hadn't meant to keep them, but somehow they'd accumulated like fallen leaves, each one a reminder of doors closed because of a number. "What's that?" She hadn't heard Thomas come in. He stood in the doorway, sleeves rolled up from doing dishes, concern crossing his face at her expression. "Nothing important," she said, moving to put them away. But one slipped free, floating, to the floor at his feet. Thomas picked it up before she could stop him. His eyes scanned the page, his jaw tightening as he read. "While we appreciate your interest," he read aloud, "our client specifically requested candidates under 40. As he wishes to start a family." He looked up, pain and anger warring in his expression. "Sarah, it's not important now," she said quickly. "That was before you." but Thomas was already untying the bundle, spreading the letters across her desk like evidence of wounds he hadn't known she carried. Too established in her ways, he read from another, set in her lifestyle, looking for someone more adaptable. His voice grew rougher with each rejection. These men, they didn't even meet you, didn't know you. Thomas, please. She reached for the letters, but he caught her hand instead. No, he said firmly. You need to hear this. These men, they're fools, every last one of them, looking for someone they can mold instead of someone who knows who she is. Sarah felt tears threatening, blinked them back. I was desperate, she admitted. The farm was struggling. I was lonely. It seemed like a practical solution. Practical. There was a gentleness in his voice that undid her more than anger would have. Love isn't practical, Sarah. It's not about checking boxes or meeting specifications. He gathered the letters into a pile, his movements deliberate. What do you want to do with these? She looked at the stack. All those rejections, all that hurt carefully typed on proper letterhead. I don't need them anymore. Thomas nodded, understanding in his eyes. Build a fire. Later, they sat together on the porch steps, watching. Sparks rise from the burning letters in the old fire pit, each one curled and blackened, turning to ash in the evening air. I sent one too, you know, Sarah said quietly. One last try, right before you came. Never did hear back. Thomas's arm tightened around her shoulders. Maybe that's because you weren't meant to be mail order. Maybe you were meant to be found. She leaned into his warmth, watching the flames consume the past. When did you know, she asked, that this was real? That first morning, watching you with the horses, you had this quiet strength about you. Knew who you were, what you wanted. He pressed a kiss to her temple. Made me want to be that sure of myself again. The fire burned lower, the letters nothing but ash now. Sarah thought about all the ways life had of surprising you, of bringing exactly what you needed in unexpected packages. You know what makes me angriest about these? Thomas gestured to the dying flames, that they made you doubt yourself, made you think your age was a drawback instead of a gift. A gift? Every line on your face, every grey hair, they're marks of a life lived with courage, of someone who knows how to love, how to endure, how to rebuild. His voice grew husky. How could anyone see that as a disadvantage? Sarah turned to face him, seeing the truth of his words in his eyes. We're quite a pair, aren't we? Both thinking we were too old for new beginnings. Maybe that's exactly why this works. He smiled, touching her cheek. We're old enough to know what matters, young enough to still be brave. The stars were coming. Out early summer constellations wheeling overhead. The ash of her past settled in the fire pit, no longer holding any power over her future. Brave enough to believe in second chances, she murmured. Thomas's answer was a kiss, tender and sure, tasting of promise and possibility. Around them, the evening crickets began their song, nature's reminder that every ending led to a new beginning. The ring wasn't new or fancy, a simple gold band that had belonged to Thomas's grandmother, he explained later. But when he placed it on the kitchen table between them that morning, it caught the sunlight like something precious. Sarah stared at it, her coffee growing cold beside her grandmother's worn ledger. She'd been showing Thomas the farm's books, planning for fall expenses, when he'd quietly pulled the ring from his pocket. Been carrying this for 2 weeks, he said, his voice rougher than usual. Waiting for the right moment. Then I realized every moment with you feels right. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her coffee cup, needing something to hold. Thomas, let me say this, he continued, gentle but determined. I'm not a young man with grand promises. Can't offer you a fancy house or world. Travels. What I can offer is this, my heart, my hands. Every day I have left to give. The morning light filled the kitchen, warming the familiar space where they'd shared so many moments. Outside, a meadowlark called, its song clear and sweet. I know we're not society's idea of a romantic couple, he said, smiling slightly. Too old for fancy proposals, they'd say. Too set in our ways. Since when do we care what they'd say? Sarah found her voice at last, surprising herself with its strength. Thomas's smile deepened. That's one of the things I love about you. You. See, past all that, past the numbers, past the expectations. He reached across the table, taking her hand in his. The ring gleamed between them, a quiet promise. My Claire, he said softly. She taught me that love isn't about perfect timing or matching society's checklist. It's about finding someone who makes you want to be better, who sees you clearly and loves you anyway. Sarah squeezed his hand, understanding the gift of hearing him speak so openly of his first love. And now I know she was right. And I know that what we have, it's different but just as real. Maybe more real because we're old enough to appreciate it. He picked up the ring, holding it in his palm like something both delicate and strong. This ring's got history, like us. Got some scratches somewhere, but the gold's still true. Sarah looked at their joined hands, weathered, marked by years of work and life, perfectly fitted together. I'm not asking you to forget your past, Thomas continued, or to change who you are. I'm asking if you'll share your future with me. Build something new, right here on this land you love so much. The farm, Sarah began, practical even now. Will be ours together, he finished. Already talked to Jessica. She's willing to sell my share of the Montana property, enough to buy that south pasture, make some improvements here. Sarah felt tears threatening, blinked them back. You've thought this through. Had plenty of time to think these past months. About what matters, about how love's better the second time around, when you choose it with your whole heart, your whole self. He held up the ring, question in his eyes. Sarah Mitchell, will you marry me? Grey hair, laugh lines and all? She looked at the ring, at this man who'd wandered into her life with a limping horse and stayed to rebuild more than just her barn, who'd never once made her feel that her age was anything but an asset, her independence anything but attractive. Yes, she said simply, feeling the rightness of it settle in her bones. Grey hair, laugh lines and all. The ring slid onto her finger, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Thomas's hands shook slightly as he placed it there, and she loved him more for that moment of vulnerability. Perfect fit, he murmured. Like us, she replied, and kissed him. Later, they stood on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky. In celebration colors, Sarah's hand felt different with the ring, but right, like the way Thomas's presence in her life had felt strange at first, then essential. What are you thinking? He asked, his arm warm around her waist. She showed him her hand in the fading light, the gold band catching the sun's last rays. That some things get better with age, like fine wine. And love? He suggested. And love, she agreed, especially love. They stood together as evening settled over their land, not young lovers racing toward a future, but mature hearts walking steadily toward shared dreams, knowing the value of each step, each moment, each breath together. Sarah stood before her grandmother's full-length mirror, running her hands over the simple, cream-colored dress she'd made from vintage silk. No traditional white wedding gown. This was a dress that honored who she was, with delicate handwork she'd learned at her grandmother's knee. Mary appeared in the reflection behind her, holding a small bouquet of purple irises. From Thomas, she said, eyes bright with happy tears. Said these were important. Sarah's fingers trembled as she took the flowers, remembering Thomas's pressed iris, his first wife's favorite. Not a replacement of the past, but an honoring of it, a bridge between then and now. The whole town's out there, Mary continued, adjusting Sarah's silver-streaked hair. Even Mrs. Peterson, if you can believe it, though I suspect she came just to have something to talk about. Let her, Sarah said softly. Let them all see what love looks like when it's chosen with wisdom. Through the church window, she could see the gathering crowd. Farmers in cleaned-up work boots, ranchers in their Sunday best. Jessica stood near the front, her 2 children fidgeting in their dress clothes. The boy, Tommy, clutched a small box containing the rings. Your grandmother would be proud, Mary said, straightening Sarah's necklace, a simple pearl that had been her mother's. She always said you had the sense to wait for what was right, not just what was offered. The church's old wooden floors creaked as the Reverend's wife poked her head in. It's time, if you're ready. Sarah took one last look in the mirror. The woman who gazed back wasn't young, wasn't perfect, wasn't what those mail-order advertisements had wanted. She was better. She was herself, lined and lovely, aged like fine wood to a deeper beauty. The small church filled with morning light as Sarah walked down the aisle alone. Her choice, no one giving her away, because she was giving herself freely and fully. Thomas waited at the altar, his eyes finding hers with a certainty that made her heart steady. He wore his best clothes, but it was his expression that transformed him. Joy and wonder written plain on his face, visible to everyone who'd ever doubted that love could bloom in autumn. "Well, look at that," she heard Mrs. Peterson whisper. "They actually look right together." The ceremony was simple, honest as the people making their vows. They'd written their own words, speaking of second chances and hard-won wisdom, of love that came not too late, but right on time. "I choose you," Thomas said, his voice carrying to the back pews, "not in spite of our years, but because of them. Because you know who you are, and you help me remember who I am." "I choose you," Sarah responded, holding his weathered hands. In hers, "because you understand that love, like wine and wisdom, gets better with age." Tommy presented the rings with solemn importance, beaming when his grandfather winked at him. The gold bands slipped into place like they'd belonged there all along. After the celebration spilled out onto Sarah's land, their land now, tables groaned with potluck dishes. Someone's fiddle started up a tune, and the afternoon stretched golden and warm around them. "May I have this dance?" Thomas asked his new wife, leading her to the space cleared between tables. They moved together, as they had that first time with the record player, but now without hesitation, without ghosts between them. Sarah caught Jessica watching them, saw the tears in her eyes turn to a smile. "You know," Mary said loudly to Mrs. Peterson over by the punch bowl, "I don't think I've ever seen a more right-looking couple." Mrs. Peterson, mellowed by wedding cake and sunshine, nodded. "They do seem to fit, don't they? Like puzzle pieces that were just waiting to find each other." As evening approached, Sarah and Thomas stood on their porch, watching their guests celebrate. The fairy lights strung in the old oak tree began to twinkle, fireflies rising to join them in the dusk. "Happy?" Thomas asked, his arm warm around her waist. Sarah leaned into him, feeling the wedding band solid on her finger. "More than. This is what I was waiting for all those years. Not just any marriage, this one, this love." Inside her pocket, she could feel the edges of her last mail-order bride application, the one that had never received a response. She'd carry it inside later, add it to their memory box, not as a reminder of rejection, but as proof that sometimes life's no answers were just making way for the right yes. The mortgage papers lay spread across the kitchen table like storm clouds on a summer day. Sarah and Thomas sat side by side, shoulders touching as they studied the numbers that refused to add up the way they needed them to. "Bank's not budging," Thomas said, his finger tracing the interest rate that had suddenly jumped. "Said with rates climbing everywhere, they can't make an exception, even with our history." Sarah picked up her grandmother's ledger, its pages worn smooth with years of careful calculations. "We're not the only ones struggling. Anderson's asking more for that south pasture now, with the housing developers sniffing around. Thomas's hadn't found hers beneath the table, warm and steady. We'll figure it out, maybe postpone buying the pasture." "No," Sarah's voice was firm. "That land's part of our future. We just need to think differently about how to get there." She opened the ledger to her latest entries, farmers' market earnings, honey sales, the small but growing income from her new YouTube channel, where she shared her grandmother's recipes and farming wisdom. "Look," she said, pointing to the numbers. The video about traditional canning techniques got over 10,000 views. People want to learn these old ways, Thomas. They're hungry for what we know. Thomas leaned closer, his reading glasses perched on his nose. You mean expand the online teaching? Why not? We've got stories to tell, skills to share. She squeezed his hand. Knowledge earned through years of living. Isn't that worth something? He was quiet for a moment, thinking. Jessica mentioned something about her marketing firm looking for authentic content. Said our wedding video got shared more times than any professional ad they'd made that month. See? People respond to real things, real love, real experience. Sarah stood, excitement building. We could offer workshops here at the farm, traditional skills, sustainable living. Combine it with your online presence, Thomas added, catching her enthusiasm. I could share what I know about ranch management, animal husbandry. Sarah pulled out a fresh page in the ledger, her pen moving quickly. Summer workshops in the barn, online courses in winter, maybe even weekend retreats for couples looking to start their own homesteads. They worked late into the evening, plotting and planning, their coffee growing cold as possibilities expanded. The mortgage papers still lay on the table, but they seemed less threatening now, more like a challenge to be met than a barrier to be feared. It won't be easy, Thomas said finally, rubbing his tired eyes. Learning all this new technology, putting ourselves out there. Sarah smiled, remembering all the other things they'd been told would be too hard, too late, too much for people their age. When has easy ever been our style? The next morning, they sat together on the porch, laptops open as Jessica walked them through setting up a proper business website. Tommy, visiting for the weekend, played with the barn cats in the yard. You're sure about this? Jessica asked, showing them how to create an email newsletter. It's a lot of work, especially for old folks like us, Thomas finished, winking at his daughter. Might take us longer to learn the tech, but we've got something better than youth. We've got stories worth telling. Sarah watched Tommy trying to teach one of the kittens to sit on command, his child's voice patient and determined. It struck her that this was what they were really building. Not just a way to save the farm, but a bridge between generations, between old wisdom and new ways. That evening, as they recorded their first proper tutorial video, Thomas teaching the art of reading weather signs in nature, Sarah felt a familiar warmth in her chest. The same feeling she'd had watching him fix that first fence post, seeing him dance with her at their wedding, holding his hand through hard decisions. Love, she thought, wasn't about having all the answers. It was about facing the questions together, finding strength in shared wisdom, and being brave enough to try new paths when old ones closed. Ready? Thomas asked, adjusting the camera angle. Sarah straightened her shoulders, smiled into the lens. Ready? The frozen water pump stood like an ice sculpture in the pre-dawn darkness. Morning's first light revealing the devastation of the overnight freeze. Sarah's breath clouded in the bitter air as she watched Thomas examine the damage. His experienced, and testing the metal's brittleness. Bad, she asked, though she already knew the answer. Worst freeze I've seen in 20 years. He straightened slowly, his joints protesting the cold. Pipe split. We'll need to dig down to the line, replace the whole section before it thaws and floods. Sarah pulled her coat tighter, thinking of the animals waiting for water. The greenhouse. Plants that needed tending. How long? With both of us working? Maybe 6 hours? He glanced at the heavy sky. If the snow holds off. But Wyoming winters rarely granted wishes. By the time they'd gathered their tools and materials, the first flakes were already falling. Fat, wet snow that meant business. They worked together with the efficiency of long practice, Thomas digging while Sarah hauled away frozen dirt. When his back needed rest, they switched, her smaller frame making up in determination what it lacked in strength. Remember when you thought you were too old for this kind of work? Thomas asked during a brief break, passing her a thermos of coffee. Sarah smiled despite her exhaustion. Remember when you tried to handle everything alone? The morning wore on snow falling thicker. They'd rigged a tarp overhead, but the wind kept shifting it, dumping cold powder down their necks. Their breaths came in white puffs, hands clumsy with cold despite their gloves. "Thomas," Sarah called suddenly, pointing at the dirt wall they'd exposed. "Look!" A thin crack ran along the main waterline, spreading like a spider's web. This wasn't just about the pump anymore. The whole system was at risk. Thomas examined the crack, his expression grave. Must have been weakening for years. One good freeze was all it took. Sarah thought of their stretched budget, the mortgage they were still figuring out. "Can we fix it? Together?" He smiled, though worry-lined. His eyes, "We can fix anything." They worked through the morning and into the afternoon, the snow never letting up. Sarah's muscles screamed with every shovelful of dirt, but she kept going. She thought of all those men who'd rejected her for being too old, too set in her ways. None of them could see this strength in her, this ability to endure. Thomas worked steadily beside her, his silver hair white with snow, his movements careful but sure. He taught her that love wasn't about age or perfection, it was about showing up, about facing whatever came together. The sun was setting. When they finally made the last connection, Thomas's hands steady despite the cold as he tightened the final bolt. "Moment of truth," he said, nodding to the pump handle. Sarah gripped it, saying a silent prayer to her grandmother's spirit, and pushed down. For a moment, nothing. Then came the welcome sound of water moving through pipes, flowing clear and strong into their test bucket. "We did it," she breathed, relief making her knees weak. Thomas caught her as she sagged, both of them laughing despite their exhaustion. They were covered in mud, chilled to the bone, but triumphant. "Inside," he said, gathering their tools, "before we freeze solid." In the warmth of their kitchen, they helped each other out of mud-caked clothes. Sarah's hands shook as she made hot chocolate, her grandmother's recipe, with a splash of something stronger added. "You know what this reminds me of?" Thomas asked, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "What?" "That first storm we weathered together, when the barn roof fell in." He pulled her close, sharing warmth. "You were so worried about being too old to rebuild." Sarah remembered how young she felt now compared to those fears. "And look at us now, digging trenches in the snow, living proof that there's no age limit on capability." He kissed her, temple, his lips warm against her cold skin, or on love. Outside, the snow continued falling, covering their day's work in a clean white blanket. The water flowed strong through their repaired pipes. The animals were safe and warm, and tomorrow would bring its own challenges. But tonight they had this: the warmth of their kitchen, the strength in their tired muscles, the knowledge that together they could face whatever winter brought. "I love you," Sarah said simply, feeling his heart beat steady against her cheek. "Even when I make you dig trenches in the snow, especially then." Spring painted the land in fresh colors, tender green grass pushing through the last patches of snow. Sarah and Thomas stood at their property line, examining the new fence posts they'd just finished setting, markers of their expanding dreams. "Anderson's lawyer called," Thomas said, running his hand along the smooth wood. "Papers are ready to sign. South Pasture's ours, whenever we're ready." Sarah smiled, remembering how impossible this had seemed a year ago. Their online workshops had grown beyond expectations, their shared wisdom finding eager students across the country. The mortgage that had worried them last fall was now manageable, their combined strength making light work of old burdens. "Hard to believe it's been a year," she said, leaning into his familiar warmth. "Best year of my life," Thomas replied, then chuckled. "Well, this part of my life, anyway." That was one of the things she loved most about him. His ability to honor the past while embracing the present. Their love hadn't erased what came before. It had built upon it, like annual rings in a strong tree. They walked the fence line together, checking their work. Each post represented another piece of their future, another dream taking root. The spring wind carried the scent of fresh earth and possibility. "Jessica called this morning," Sarah said. "Tommy's desperate to spend summer break here, wants to learn everything about farming." "Everything, huh?" Thomas's eyes crinkled with joy. "Better tell him it takes more than one summer. Took us decades to learn what we know." "That's exactly why he should start now." Sarah stopped, turning to face her husband. "I've been thinking, what if we turned part of the South Pasture into a teaching farm? Not just online videos and weekend workshops, but real hands-on learning." Thomas was quiet, considering. She could see the idea taking shape in his mind, the way it aligned with everything they believed about passing on knowledge. Multi-generational learning, he said slowly. Young folks working alongside experienced farmers, sharing knowledge. Both ways. Exactly. They bring their energy and new ideas. We bring our years of experience. She gestured to the land around them. This place has always been about growing things. Why not grow wisdom too? A meadowlark called from a nearby fence post, the same song they'd heard the morning Thomas first stopped at her farm. Nature's reminder that some things came full circle. "You know what this means?" Thomas said, pulling her close. "We'll have to stick around for quite a while. Make sure all that wisdom gets passed on properly. Think we're up for it? At our age?" She asked it teasingly, the old doubt now transformed into a private joke between them. "Honey, we're just getting started." They walked back to the house, making plans. The kitchen table, where they'd first shared coffee, where Thomas had proposed, where they'd faced challenges together, became their planning center. Sarah pulled out her grandmother's ledger, its pages now interspersed with their own additions. Workshop schedules, student feedback, dreams for the future. "We'll need to build additional housing," Thomas said, sketching rough plans, "for students, visiting instructors, and expand the greenhouse." Sarah added her own notes. Maybe add a teaching kitchen for preservation workshops. As they worked, the afternoon sun filled the kitchen with golden light. Through the window, they could see the first spring flowers blooming in Sarah's garden, purple irises standing proud among the new growth. "Remember what you told that last mail-order matchmaker?" Thomas asked suddenly. "About being too set in your ways?" Sarah nodded, remembering the woman's polite dismissal. Guess she didn't realize that being set in your ways can be a strength, when they're good ways, tested by time. Outside, a truck drove past, one of their workshop participants, staying in town for their extended course on sustainable farming. The world was changing, but some knowledge remained constant, valuable. "Happy anniversary," Thomas said softly, reaching into his jacket. He pulled out a small package wrapped in simple brown paper. Inside, Sarah found a new journal, bound in soft leather like Thomas's old one. On the first page he'd written, "For our next chapter." She touched the blank pages, feeling the promise in them. "Our next chapter," she repeated. "I like the sound of that." The evening settled around them soft as a blessing. From the barn came the comfortable sounds of animals settling in for the night. The newly planted fields stretched dark and rich, waiting for tomorrow's light. And in their kitchen, two people who had found love, not too late but right on time, sat planning their future, their joined hands sure and strong on the table between them. Sarah sat at her computer, reading the latest message that had arrived through their farm's website. The woman's words glowed on the screen, achingly familiar. "I'm worried I'm too old to start over. Everyone says farming is a young person's game." Thomas peered over her shoulder, his hand warm on her back. "Sounds like someone we know." "She's 52, Sarah said softly. "Divorced. Says she's dreamed of farming all her life but always put it off. Now she thinks it's too late." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Sarah opened a new browser tab, navigating to the Western Hearts Correspondence Service, the same site that had rejected her so many times. But this time she wasn't looking for love. She was placing an advertisement of a different kind. "You sure about this?" Thomas asked, though his smile said he already knew her answer. Sarah began to type. "Experienced farming couple seeking mature individuals for mentorship program. Age is not a barrier, it's an asset. Join us at Second Chance. Farm for hands-on training in sustainable agriculture and rural living, because it's never too late to grow something new." She added a photo Mary had taken of them last week. Sarah and Thomas in their garden, silver hair shining in the sun, surrounded by flourishing plants, and beaming with the confidence of people who knew their worth. Perfect, Thomas said, reading over the finished ad. Though you might want to mention your viral video status. Famous farming influencer seeks. Sarah laughed, nudging him with her shoulder. Stop! I still can't believe our little workshops went viral. But they had their honest approach, their obvious love for each other and the land, their willingness to share decades of hard-earned wisdom. It had struck a chord. The videos of Thomas teaching weather reading had been shared thousands of times. Sarah's canning tutorials had sparked a revival of traditional food preservation among younger generations. The sound of vehicles on the gravel drive drew them to the window. Their current group of students was arriving for morning lessons, a mix of ages and backgrounds, all drawn by the promise that experience mattered more than youth. Remember when we thought this place might be too much for us? Sarah asked, watching a silver-haired woman help a younger man unload farming tools. Thomas wrapped his arms around her waist. Remember when you thought you were too old for new love? The morning light caught Sarah's wedding ring as she raised her hand to touch his cheek. 1 year of marriage had only deepened their connection, proven the wisdom of hearts that recognized their perfect timing. Outside, Mary's truck pulled up. She'd become their unofficial photographer, documenting the farm's transformation for their website. But more than that, she'd become family, part of the expanding circle of love and purpose that radiated from their shared life. Got a letter for you, Mary called, waving an envelope as she approached the porch. From that Women's Farming Coalition. Sarah opened it, Thomas reading over her shoulder, an invitation to be keynote speakers at their annual conference. The topic, Age as Asset, Revolutionizing Rural Life Through Generational Wisdom. Look at that, Thomas murmured. They want us to speak about being too old. Sarah tucked the invitation into her grandmother's ledger, now nearly full with their new ventures and expanding dreams. Funny how life turns out, isn't it? Everything we thought was holding us back turned out to be exactly what others needed to move forward, Thomas finished. They walked out together to greet their students, hand in hand. The morning sun painted the farm in shades of promise, the new teaching barn rising behind the old one, the expanded gardens where students learned hands-on techniques, the south pasture where sheep grazed contentedly. Welcome to Second Chance Farm, Sarah called to their gathered students, where experience is never a limitation. And wisdom grows wild, Thomas added, squeezing her hand. Later, after the day's lessons were done and the evening settled soft around them, Sarah and Thomas sat on their porch swing, the same swing where they'd first shared their dreams, where they'd faced challenges, where they'd discovered that love wasn't about age, but about recognition of kindred spirits. So, Thomas said, his voice tender in the gathering dusk, ready for another year of proving them wrong about being too old. Sarah leaned into his embrace, watching the sun set over their flourishing land, ready for a lifetime of it. Above them, stars began to appear, ancient light still burning bright, still lighting the way for travelers seeking home. Just like the wisdom they shared, passed down through generations, growing stronger with each telling. They had become what they'd needed to find, proof that it was never too late for love, for dreams, for new beginnings. Their story had grown. Beyond them now, taking root in others' hearts, sprouting hope wherever it landed. Time, they had learned, was not a limitation, but a gift, and they were just getting started.